We're back, and I've lost approximately 10 years by getting rid of my Captain Caveman facial hair, and I'm here to welcome you back to the library because the library is open. That's not a jingle, maybe it should be. I'll have a think about that. We're back where it all started, same location as my very first video, mostly because I've run out of rooms, if I'm honest, if the truth be told. Some extraneous noise there. I'm coming to you today, live from my lockdown, as per. Came over a bit Queen Elizabeth there, didn't I? The second, I mean, not the first one, obviously, because what with her being dead? It's not the point, is it? Should we just start again? The library is open, everyone. So I hope you brought your library card. And I had to make this. I literally finished the book last night. No, this morning. See, I'm lying. This morning, and I had to make the video now because otherwise I was scared that I wouldn't remember the plot. That sounds like a criticism, but it's not. It's because it's a murder mystery novel, and the plot is like, there's a lot of it, which is not a criticism. As I say, it's a good book, but excuse me, but I was having sleepless nights thinking, how am I going to explain this? So I thought I'd just do it as soon as possible before I forget. So this, I actually don't have a physical copy of this book. I read this on my e-reader. I was going to say Kindle, but they're not paying me, so why should I give them free? Ah, I've just said it now. I'm not averse to sponsorship deals, just so we're all aware. I read it on my e-reader, anyway, of whatever brand. And it is Mortmain Hall by Martin Edwards, who is a crime writer, and you may recognise his name from, he's instrumental in the British library crime classics, you know, where they're sort of publishing old out-of-print fiction of, like, often like the golden age of crime, for modern readers, you know, things that are sort of slipped into obscurity and some stuff that maybe isn't widely read anymore because it just fell out of fashion or whatever. He's also, I think he's the president of the Detection Club as well, or if it's not that, I apologise, it's something pretty big in crime publishing anyway, so he's kind of, it's a bit like, I suppose, like a sort of expert in crime writing, writing a book. And Mortmain Hall is the second novel in his Rachel Savanake series. So the first one came out a couple of years ago, but I only read it fairly recently in the last couple of months. It was called Gallows Court, and this is the second. So I'll try and explain the plot, albeit as briefly as I can. So we start off with a man who is living under a false identity, who is on a train, the Necropolis Railway, which was apparently, at the time, it was set in the 30s, by the way, in the UK. And I do love that. I love a vintagey murder mystery, because this one's modern written, it only came out this year, but it's set in that period. I think I've mentioned this before, I don't really like crime when it's like modern thrillery sort of thing, or set in contemporary society. It holds less sway for me, and I don't know why. Although, I have been reading a lot, listening to a podcast, which I'm really enjoying at the moment, called She Done It, which is sort of about like classic crime fiction and the tropes involved with it and why we like it so much. And that sort of talked about, there was an episode called Crime at Christmas, where they sort of talked about how the cosy atmosphere and the contrast and the idea of, you know, a forgotten or a lost Britain, which is probably false, how that's a sort of comfort because it's removed enough from our lives that we can like get in there with the violent crime and so on and so forth, but also close enough to reality that we recognise it, if that makes sense. I'll talk more about that in a bit. Anyway, so yeah, set in the 30s, and this railway was basically built to visit grave sites in London. So there's this guy who is living under a false name, but his real name's Gilbert Payne, and our protagonist, Rachel Savanake, who I'll speak about in a second, offers him a lifeline in the opening scene where she sort of says, look, if you get on this railway, you go to the grave side of the person you're going to, and then you get back on the railway, you're going to die, basically. she tells him that she knows that he's been living under an assumed name out of England and he's just returned to the country. Anyway, he doesn't believe that, and sure enough, he falls victim to a what looks like an accident. It looks like he fell off the railway, but we know that he's been murdered. At the same time, a young reporter called Jacob, who also from the first novel, he's sort of our dual protagonist, if you will, is at a trial at the Old Bailey for a man named Danskin, who is about to be sentenced to the hangman for his for the death of a tramp who died in a car fire. And then at the very last minute, a colonel turns up who gives him an alibi, basically, and he gets away with it. And Jacob meets a woman at the Old Bailey trial who's been into what's called Leonora Dobble, who knows that he's acquainted with Rachel Savanaig. They met in the first book, Gallows Court, and she asks her to get a message to Rachel. Asks him to get a message to Rachel, and she wants to meet to talk to her about murder. So Jacob goes to see Rachel, and it turns out that this woman is a criminologist who writes under an assumed name, and her speciality is sort of miscarriages of justice or people who got away with committing the perfect murder. And then meanwhile, we also follow a third point of view, which is a guy called Reggie Vickers, who works in some quite underling capacity in one of the government departments. And he has been left by his lover, who, sidebar, we're never told the sex of the lover, but I think what's really interesting in fiction or in anything is when someone doesn't tell you the sex of their lover, I automatically assume that it's a same-sex relationship, which is true. It's just because, you know, that deliberate avoidance of pronouns and the deliberate overuse of the name to cover that, it's just a bit of a giveaway. I can see what you're trying to do here. But that's fine. That's absolutely fine, of course. And he is somehow involved with some scandal that's going on in this place called the Clandestine Club, which is in Soho, which we're sort of led to believe is like a gay-friendly bar that's frequented by people who have to access it using a password and so on and so forth. And it's like a real eclectic mix of sort of people with what's described as like deviant desires or forbidden pleasures or whatever. And then we're sort of like, how do these three plot lines relate to one another? And that's what happens in the book, which is why it was really difficult to explain, because it was like, how do I cover everything without giving spoilers? Because I'm never going to do that in crime. Because I think that's half the pleasure of a whodunit, isn't it? So that's the basic premise that we're thrown into. What's great about this series is, I think, while it maintains that kind of golden age of the murder mystery novel, what it's really good at is also undercutting that with some social realism. I think more than ever now we're seeing, particularly in our society at the moment, wherever you are in the world, this sort of weird idea of like Blitz spirit and the golden age and so on and so forth, a real romanticisation of the wars or things that happened before or after the wars, when which are essentially in many ways a fairy tale. I mean, I think I was thinking the other day that the home front of World War II is so romanticised that it's almost overtaken Cinderella as Britain's favourite fairy tale. Because we want to believe that it was this amazing time of community spirit, and it kind of was in a way, but it was also a horrible time where people weren't choosing these circumstances, they were forced into them. You know, it's like that whole thing about, you know, when people used to shelter on the underground in the Second World War, like, as though that was an amazing government innovation. Well, it wasn't, because the people did that, not the government. The people broke into the London Underground because they were afraid to stay in their homes, or they didn't have any shelters, and eventually the government just had to let them, which is a really interesting example of how history gets rewritten with hindsight. And I can't remember who was talking to, one of my students actually said to me the other day, I can't remember who said the quote, but they said that they'd read once that every time you tell a story, you tell another lie. So every time you're talking about the past, it becomes more and more fictionalised, and I think that's good and applicable here. Not good in itself, but applicable here in terms of that's how we end up looking at historical events through rose-tinted glasses. But what Mortmain Hall and what Gallows Court did as well was sort of show the seedy underside of that, or rather what I suspect is the reality. And you know, it talks quite candidly about, you know, how bad conditions were for people after the First World War. Obviously this is the 30s, prior to outbreak of the Second, and there's sort of hints of the Second World War that's to come, which we know with hindsight, but obviously the characters don't. It talks about civil unrest and the general strikes and labour disputes and the machinations of the government, who were trying to create this land for heroes that had come back from the war, and how that was part of a larger fabrication. So that's really nice in a way, because it kind of gives you that social realism, but without denying you that sort of golden age vibe. So it's vintagey, but with a twist. The other thing that makes these two novels, now it's the series, Gallows Court and Mortmain Hall, is the protagonists, because they're so interesting, because I think we're really used to sort of detectives who are really personable, or they're quirky and a little bit aloof, but in an ultimately lovable way. Whereas we have someone like Rachel Savanek, who has quite an interesting backstory, where she was the daughter of a judge who, sort of, in her words, lost his marbles towards the end, and imprisoned her in this weird island called Gaunt House, on an island. And they had a really odd relationship, and, you know, she's very sort of personable, I guess. She's not warm. She's very sure of herself. She doesn't suffer fools gladly, and we don't ever get an insight into her mind. She's sort of seen at one remove. So she's sort of this quite cold but fiercely intelligent figure who is really good at thinking about and conceptualizing crime, and, you know, she can be cruel, she can be cutting, she can be devoid of sympathy, and that makes her an intriguing character, because you want more about her, you want to know her more, but you can't. And I think Martin and Edwards juggles that beautifully with this character, because you come away at the end and you know, after two novels, I know very few details about her. And I think that's going to be a really interesting character arc, as presumably the series will carry on and we'll just tease more and more out. So we kind of see the story more through Jacob's, the reporter's eyes, and sort of his impressions of Rachel as well, because she's as not cruel, but she's as cold to him as she is to everybody else in the novel, with the exception of her housekeeper and her housekeeper's family, who she grew up with on the island, where she was born. And their sort of quite fractious relationship, where he sort of plays the Hastings role from Poirot, if you get me, where he's telling her things, discoveries he's made, and blah 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 blah, and so on and so forth. And we get the impression all the way through that she's always one step ahead of him. She knows exactly what's going on, and she uses him to her ends, and she is a character who will only reveal what she wants to reveal and when she wants to reveal it. So that's really interesting. It's also really interesting insight as well into the newspaper industry. So I'm not sure if Martin ever worked in media or the press or anything, but it rings very true for the day, because Jacob's become a crime reporter, but he talks quite candidly about how newspapers work and so on and so forth, and looks at the spin of the media and how stories are related, and I think we all know that that's still an issue today. So I suppose it's good that some things don't change. Or is it bad? It's definitely bad. So yeah, and these three plotlines coalesce. What's really interesting as well about this is the main, if I can say that, murder doesn't take place till about 82%, because on an e-reader it shows you how many percent along you are. About 82% way into the book, the actual murders, if this was a traditional crime novel, whereas everything else is sort of part of a bigger story that comes out. So there's actually two plot lines to resolve in this. One is this issue around Reggie Vickers and the government department and what's going on there, and the sort of shady political things, and also how that intersects with the Leonora Dobell's, the criminologist's, work on unsolved crimes, or rather miscarriages of justice, and what's the connection there, because it's not immediately apparent. And I have to say that in the true fashion of, which I hope was intentional, true fashion of Agatha Christie's kind of non-Poirot, Miss Marple spy novels, things like The Secret Adversary or The Man in the Brown Suit, or a sort of standalone thrillers, things like that. It's very sort of that, in the sense that it almost feels like spoof when they unravel that plot line, because it's all about like spying and intrigue and so on and so forth, which is not to give anything away, you get that impression from the start, but I really hope that was a kind of loving pastiche to that particular genre of crime novels. So yeah, it's a lot, but you kind of go along with it because Martin Edwards is a good writer, so it kind of makes sense, even though you're like, this is very sort of out there as an explanation. And then, yeah, the wrap-up turns out to only be very tremulously linked to that plot line with the murders. But it's a fascinating piece of work. I'm always in awe of people who can sort of spin that web of, here's where we need to end up, here's where we start from, and just not get tangled in their own plot lines, if that makes sense. I mean, that must take a lot of work and brain power, and I really admire that. Funnily enough, I know I've mentioned Agatha Christie a lot, but because she's sort of the queen of crime, as it were, or that was their moniker, there are a lot of connections to that. So she almost stands in as a sort of representative of the genre from the golden age of crime. And what reminded me as well in this book is one of her novels called Cards on the Table, which is a Poirot novel about a card game that happens where 4 murderers and 4 detectives are invited to play bridge, and at the end of the game one of them's dead, and there is a house party where in the novel where the criminologist has invited 4 people that she thinks got away with murder to the house, and yada 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 yada. So it's a bit like, it comes across as like a bit of a mega mix, if you will, of the sort of highlights of the genre. There are all those cliches in detective fiction. You have things like the body in the locked room, or the so-called impossible crime that no one could have committed, the stopped clocks which show the time of the murder but they can be manipulated, so on and so forth. So if it's an homage to that, and I really think it might be, then it's very successful. It's a lovely piece of reading, this. I really enjoyed it. This was one of my bedtime books, so I went to bed with this. Misses. But it's page turner. Well, what do you call it when it's online? It can't really be a page turner, a page skimmer. Going like that a lot. Had to know what happened next, and it went by in a flash. It was really, really good. So I definitely recommend this series. If you love crime fiction and you love homages with a twist to classic tropes, then I completely recommend this. I would also recommend you check out Martin Edwards' Anthologies. He does the editing of a lot of the British Crime Library classics, like compendiums of short stories, so they'll have themed ones come out with like murders that happened on trains, murders that happened at, ski resorts, murders at Christmas, things like that, and they're really delightful. They're like old stories that have not maybe got the attention they should have got, but he writes knowledgeably on them as like a preface as well and stuff. So I do think it's worth seeing a master, if you will, at work. So yeah, that's Mortmain Hall, and I actually got through that a lot quicker than I thought I was going to do, and with a lot less convolution. Because it's also about deciding what to leave out of the plot description so that I don't ruin it for you. Because that's half the fun with a whodunit, isn't it? Like, I never bother about trying to work out who the killer or killers or whatever are in book. I just like being along for the ride, which is weird because with TV shows I love spoilers. So I don't care about who knowing, like for instance on reality shows, I don't care about knowing who's won before I watch the episode or whatever. But with that, I don't want to know who's done the murder but I also don't want to guess. But that's great. It's a little bit like choose your own adventure, isn't it? Maybe you do like to guess. What do you do with crime peoples? Do you try and guess as you go along? Do you play the detective? Oh yeah, that's brilliant as well. At the end, there's a thing called the Clue Finder, which apparently was really popular in maybe the 20s, 30s, I think, where what they do at the back of the novel is put in where all the clues have been laid by the writer for the detective to find. And what Martin Edwards does is, which again makes me think that this was intentionally an homage, is he lists every page number where there was a clue drop to the identity of the murderer. So if you do read this, don't flick to the back, otherwise you'll know. Yes, that's really interesting. A fabulous portrait of Britain between the wars and the underside of it, and also really interesting as well on a personal level to read about like the queer underside of the 30s, which is we hear more these days about you know, queerness in the 50s and the 60s, and some bits about the war and the armed forces and so on and so forth, but stuff from the 20s and 30s less so. So that was really interesting to look at what bars like that looked like, albeit briefly, back then. So yeah, delightful. Do let me know what kind of crime novels you enjoy, because I'm always in the mood. Keep them classical. I'm more of a Dorothy L. Sayers than a struggles to think of modern crime writer and fails miserably, but you get the idea. Alright, it's been delightful. I hope you're all staying safe and taking care of yourselves and getting your government mandated exercise. I'm going to go and make another cup of tea now, because I've just realised I haven't had a brew with this video, which is tantamount to treason. It's the only library where you're encouraged to bring food and drink. So, that's the library for this episode. The library is now closed, darling. And put that library card safe. It's wiped clean for a reason. Alright, take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the very next episode. Mwah.